Hi, I'm Steelfur of Steelfur Speaks. Um, I've been awake for 24 hours at this point. I've literally just landed from a flight, but I'm full of coffee, and there's plenty of interesting things happening in the fab market. We've also obviously just seen the end of Pro Tour LA. Very, very exciting tournament. Casting was great. Whole vibe was great. I was really sort of enjoying watching the bits that I could. I was in Orlando, so I was kind of like almost synced up, but I was working, so it was a bit tricky to get all of it. But it has sparked a bit of a discussion about limited in competitive level events that I kind of want to address. Now, I'm a bit jet lagged, so we are gonna sort of like do this. We're gonna do this live with like let's not mess around. We're gonna do this live. We're gonna do this with Microsoft. Okay. This is the best way we're gonna do this, right? So we're gonna do this with Microsoft Word. Now, let's just break this down, right? So what feedback are we hearing about drafting at the Pro Tour? So let's kind of break this down. You've got like the preparation, right, aspects. You've got like the gameplay, or we'll call them like tournament day aspects. And then you've got like the variance aspects, right? So let's just kind of break this down. We'll see what other sort of titles come out while we're doing this, okay? And I want to make sure we're having like quite a detailed discussion. I do think, and I have seen some people say like, I'm not playing limited because I don't enjoy it, and that's good enough. Like that is a perfectly good enough individual answer. Like if you turn around and say, I don't enjoy limited, I'm not good at it, I don't want to play it, etc. Like that's a good enough answer for you. And some people have said, look, I'm not going to go to the sealed calling because I'm not going to do well in sealed, and then I can't draft on day 2. And that's a perfectly good decision. But obviously, draft is an ingrained part of the Pro Tour scene. And that, of course, leads us to that meta question. Should it be? Now, obviously, the developers believe that it should. It helps sell boxes. It's an integral part of TCG design and limited design. And we'll get on in a minute to whether or not we feel like Fab is the game that is good for limited, or whether it's a legacy that we've taken from other card games that maybe doesn't necessarily fit the Fab design formula very well. But let's start off with this idea of preparation, because I think that's a very important topic. So when we think about preparation for a draft event, there's obviously a lot of work you need to do to prepare for something like a Pro Tour. And if you're preparing a CC deck, and then you're also preparing a draft deck, that is twice the amount of preparation. So some of the feedback that I've seen on Twitter and from other discussion groups that I'm in is just that people feel like they're being pushed out of these events because of the amount of preparation that's required to prepare for 2 formats. And that was definitely the feedback from the First World, which also had Blitz included as a format. And I know that Blitz was subsequently cut, probably for this preparation reason. So to a certain extent, people are saying, I don't feel like I have time to prepare, and therefore I'm being selected out of a Pro Tour. Now, there is a broader question, just a question for the community, as to what level of preparation we require from the best player in the game. Maybe it is the person who has the free time to prepare both the draft and the limited format of a Pro Tour. But I think it is worth having that discussion and thinking about where we are in terms of life cycle of gaming, right? So, I know from my own audience demographics that the age range of the people who watch my channel, there are 1,500 subscribers now, so there are quite a few of you guys who tune into my videos across all of the different ones. And, I say guys because a lot of you are still male. Unfortunately, I do have quite a few, I do have some female watchers, so that's good too, power on. We're here to support that. But the point is that, and you can kind of see this when you look at something like World of Warcraft as well, is that previously the demographic for a game like World of Warcraft was the 20 to 35-year-old who, had a job but didn't have that much money, didn't have kids, that kind of thing. And now we've entered into this scenario where the average age of a gamer approaching a game like Fab, or all of the subscription games online or other TCGs, the younger crowd is still being drawn in by Pokemon and One Piece and Yu-Gi-Oh! And the demographic that Fab is attracting is genuinely, I think, on average, maybe 5 to 8 years higher than it would have been if we thought about TCGs maybe 10 years ago, right? So we're looking at this demographic of 35 to 44-year-olds. Now, what is the sort of thing that's happening in the lifespan of a lot of your average Fab players? They're having kids, they're working very, very hard at their jobs, because, statistically you earn the most money in your career between your late 30s and the end of your 50s, and then you sort of plateau in your 50s to 60s and then retire, right? That is the typical sort of roadmap that most people take. So a lot of people, if you're in your mid to late 30s, you're gearing up for this big work push where you're earning a lot of money, all these kind of things, and you don't have as much time for hobbies. So if the demographic for Fab is truly shifted, and I think it would be good to hear other people's thoughts on this, to mid 30s or like 30 to 40 instead of say 22 to 30, right? Then we're looking at people who are, we'll say this, just time poor. And then when you consider as well all the other things that are going on, the macroeconomic climate, and as that reminder, I am a market strategy analyst, I'm a business analyst, so macroeconomic climate is something I talk about a lot, especially when it talks about how it impacts consumer spending and consumer trends, right? The pressures of a macroeconomic climate extend far beyond individual instances of individual occurrences, right? So you can't just say, well, the macroeconomics mean that he has to work longer, right? He has to work half an hour longer every day, though that can also be true. But the actual pressures of the stress of not having as much money previously, the amount of work it takes to sustain a similar level of lifestyle, especially if you have a family and dependents at that level, on a lower income or at a lower income due to inflation, is higher as well. So that could be the same thing as like, well, you still want to maintain the same level of grocery shopping, but that means shopping around for deals. That means taking time to do those kind of things. So when we say that the general macroeconomic climate makes people have less free time, that is also something to consider. Now, Fab is a luxury hobby, and before anyone gets up at me on that, the baseline for a competitive Fab deck is what, like $200-$300 of free income? Like, that's a luxury hobby, right? A non-luxury hobby is going for a walk in the park or taking up jogging, because you can buy a pair of running shoes for like 40 quid. But Fab is a luxury hobby, especially when you include all this travel to events. And the fact is that when you're in a bad macroeconomic climate, you're struggling, to maintain your lifestyle in the face of rapid inflation, which is happening across most of Western Europe and in the US, especially food inflation as well. A lot more of your time is dedicated towards maintaining that lifestyle. So when we talk about the current climate and the current gamer that is approaching Fab, we can see the age range. We can see the typical pressures on that age demographic. How many of the Fab players that have kids? How many of them are working really hard at work trying to get a promotion or trying to get set up for their career? And then look at that environment. So then when you start to see this feedback that people are saying, I don't want to prepare for draft and CC for a large event, that's where that feedback is coming from. And in that context, it makes a lot of sense. Of course, there is that discussion of who is a competitive Fab event for. And we've kind of had this kind of lurking thing in the background where, and I don't know about the latest Pro Tour winner, the Lisan Al Gaib. I love that meme. I don't know what his employment status is, but we have to be honest that the last two Pro Tour winners, I'm thinking Pablo, Matt, Pablo and Matt, both, as far as I know, were reasonably unemployed in the lead up to their win. And I know Michael Hamilton was in the process of being between jobs in the lead up to his World Championship win. I don't know about Alex, but my point is that there is a direct correlation between those people who are in between work but have the funds to live and the people who are winning large events. And that kind of it's not putting shade on them, because obviously the amount of work you put in should lead to results, and Fab is a skill-based game. It's merely asking the question, like, what is a reasonable expectation in terms of practice and preparation for a player at a large event, right? And we could enter a situation where we say, actually, we want to make competitive Fab as accessible as possible. So rather than having a mixed format tournament, so draft and the CC, we're actually going to move to a Pro Tour that is one format, so either draft or CC. And what that does is basically halve the amount of preparation time that someone needs to do to be competitive. And what that does then is open up the realm and acknowledge the fact that there are lots of people with kids who are struggling or who need to work more, or all these kind of things, who also deserve to be able to be competitive at their hobby, and that the people who are winning shouldn't be only the people with lots of free time to dedicate to Fab, but actually it would be okay if the people who are winning had a reasonable amount of free time to dedicate to Fab. Enough time to prepare a CC deck, test against the meta, but not enough time to do loads of draft camps. So when we talk about the preparation, let's just re-summarize. So we're talking about preparation. We're talking about time poor due to average FAB player age and typical life commitments of that age bracket. And that doesn't just include kids, right? There's people without kids who are, we're getting into that age where people are starting to have to look after their parents, who are getting elderly. They have their own medical problems. They're more likely to have medical problems. They're more likely to be struggling with health and weight gain and needing to exercise more. Let's just say, e.g., work, kids. Yeah. And then we can think about like the other things, which is like macroeconomics leading to less free time / money to pivot between different decks, right? That might be an argument for having a draft only Pro Tour, right? Is that might theoretically be cheaper than building a competitive deck. So if there was a year where there was really bad economic crisis, you could theoretically have a FAB draft one instead. But then no one's going to be traveling to these things, right? So it's a bit tricky. But the point is that whatever way you look at it, macroeconomics lead to less free time and money as more time is spent looking for economic saving. So we think about that, and we just think about, just the amount of time taken to prepare for mixed bad events versus single format events. Okay, so that's one of the parts of the feedback, is just, I don't want to prepare for 2 formats, I want to prepare for 1, and here's some of the reasons that that's kind of coming around. Aside from people just not liking one of the formats, right? So let's look at like sort of tournament day aspects gameplay. So when I say tournament day aspects, what are we talking about? So the people who've given this kind of feedback are basically talking about their own mindset. They don't like switching between the draft mindset and the CC mindset. They find that more difficult. Again, we're talking about different mindsets for different formats. One of the things that's come up a lot on this channel recently, and I know certainly some of the judges have been discussing it, and there's been pitches to discuss it in more detail at the judge conference, is the role of sort of neurodiversity and making FAB more accessible to people who approach things from different angles and with different like approaches to gaming. One of the things that is an obstacle to some people that I've heard on Twitter and through various discourses is the switching between the draft mindset and the CC mindset. Some people find it much easier to just be in one mindset for one format of the game. And this is the thing. So a lot of the thing we're talking about now, it's not about necessarily skill in a format of the game. We're actually talking about the role of having multiple formats on the day versus the actual whether or not someone is a good player in a specific format. So when we talk about opening things up, we could have someone who is, not good at switching between different formats on the day of a tournament, but is very good at both of those formats. We're talking about someone who, if it was just a draft PT, would win the draft PT, or if it was just a CC PT, would win the CC PT. But they don't, because they are forced to endure a change in formats, right? So that's one piece of feedback. Another piece of feedback that I've had, which I think is very interesting, is the effect of draft on the CC meta, right? So what does that mean? If you get to the top 8 in a Pro Tour, right, with a CC deck, now you've been testing CC, you know what the good decks are, you know what your counters are, you know ideally what will happen in a Swiss environment if all of these decks go in. You have a good idea of what will make the top 8. Then the draft comes along like a big sort of bugbear in the background and says, well, actually, this player who's playing Levia is going to go 3-0 in the draft, and suddenly they're in the top bracket when actually they shouldn't be, because if the draft was actually... So, for example, they went 2-1 in CC and then 3-0 in the draft, so they're a 5-1 player. But actually, if they went 6 rounds of CC, they'd be 3-3. Now, suddenly there's this Levia coming up behind you. And then suddenly, again, we're coming back to this, how do you prepare for CC events? When you have to consider the effect of a draft on a CC meta, suddenly you have a lot more effort needing to go into prepare against other decks that might come up, because the draft elevates those decks to a position that they don't deserve. And I'd argue that there's more to this as well, in terms of like giving those players you almost get into a negative experience where their CC deck isn't as good as their draft skill. And that kind of pushes them into an environment where they're not going to be having particularly fun games because they're not playing a deck that can compete against the top meta decks, but they are still thrust into that meta. And it's kind of fun because it generates those stories where they can have that change, but there are some negatives to it as well. But I think it is interesting the effect that having that mixed format does have on the CC meta. It's not always positive in terms of preparation time and getting you ready. But of course, adaptability is a key skill for competitive TCG players, so it's not all bad. The other thing is a bit of a difficult topic, and I wanna just embrace this as honestly as possible. I've said these things in my videos before. LSS knows what I think about it. They know I think sometimes they do a fantastic job. I think they do a fantastic job overall. But the fact is that some limited sets miss the mark, right? Okay. And obviously Bright Lights is sitting there as the big example. I know a few people who like Bright Lights draft. They're not that many, and that they're only the ones who've played it a lot, and maybe that just says that it's a really skill-intensive format, but not everyone at the table is going to draft in a skill-intensive way, so you have to build a set that is somewhat accessible, otherwise even your top-tier tables will break down, right? So let's just break this down. Okay, so set too complicated, and what does that lead to? That leads to skewed tables, even at top-tier events. And we had some drafts, even at the Pro Tour, even in like the 3-1 bracket, where there were 4 or 5 of one hero, because people thought they were open, right? And this is even in heavy, right, which is considered one of the best limited sets that's been made for the game. So that happens even in top tier drafting, even in the best limited set of the game, right? Set is too simple, and this just leads to homogenization of decks, clear leader that everyone wants to draft, right? Think something like Uprising, right? The set's kind of simple. Everyone wants to draft the same hero, leading to lots of forcing, But the biggest thing for me when it comes to limited sets missing the mark is unknown quality of limited when planning for event attendance, right? Now, this has been said to me by 3 or 4 people who I would consider to be pro players. One of the big concerns they have with FAB Limited is that, now, obviously Heavy was good, but the set immediately prior to that, Bright Lights, not considered to be as good, or even in the top rankings of good draft sets. Some of them have been good, some of them have been bad. There is that genuinely a perception that LSS has not yet cracked the magic formula for draft in FAB, and even to a certain extent, the more cynical people saying that FAB itself, because of the hard restriction of classes, is not ever going to be like that top tier draft game, because ultimately you can't see a bomb in pack 3 and like splash it, which is what makes drafting fun in a lot of other sets, so a lot of the games. So for example, I've been drafting Star Wars Unlimited recently, and people who know Star Wars Unlimited know that you have to build a deck which features these pips, these matching colors symbols. But if you want to play a card that does not perfectly match the color symbols of your deck, you can play it for an extra 2 resources. Similarly, in Magic, if you draft a bomb from a different color, you can splash to achieve that bomb. And a lot of sets come with ramp and things that get you the other lands you need, and it becomes kind of reliable to splash that bomb. Meanwhile, in FAB, aside from the generic bombs, you could very easily open a Majestic in the last pack alongside a card that's really good for your deck, and you can't use that Majestic even if it's really good. You have to give it to the person next to you or hate draft it, and it just creates this really sort of, that's not the only example, but pack 3 does feel like it's not as like decisive as it should be. It feels like everyone's set in their seat and kind of drafting, and the draft is already done. Everyone's just picking the best card for their seat from the pack, right? So there are a group of people who think FAB is just not a game that's ever going to deliver draft in like the perfect way, and I just want to acknowledge them. I don't know that I agree with them because I've had a lot of fun playing Heavy, but their feedback was if Heavy is like the best that draft can be, it still isn't doing enough to keep them interested in the draft set, because when they do the draft, almost every draft feels like it ends up with very, very similar decks, and they just feel like that's letting them down in terms of a game that's supposed to have a rich, limited environment, and they just prefer if it was an entirely CC environment. And it's just entirely constructed for the deck variants and all those kind of things. And they've kind of written off limited fab. Now, obviously, I continue, and I've said this previously, continue to be surprised by LSS design. Every time I think I understand where the boundaries are for their game, they come out with a new thing like Mystic Resources and Chi and stuff. And they surprise me, and they invent things that are innovative. One of the reasons I think that they are continuing to be an up and coming studio compared to other studios which are stagnating is that every set they do seem to come up with something interesting and new and fresh that gets the player base re-engaged. Whether Clash is lifted from Magic, but it is used in an interesting way in Fab, or this new Chi resource. All these kind of things are interesting. They're keeping me engaged. So I have faith in LSS trying new things and trying to unlock the final form of Fab Limited, but I also want to acknowledge the frustrations of people who are saying that they don't feel like that Fab is good at Limited, and they don't feel like the game's hero class design lends itself well to Limited. And there are other things that can be tried, to solve that. Maybe limited splashing, splash one card or one copy of a card from another class in your limited deck, and there are rules changes and there are design changes. There's loads of experimentation LSS could do. We're just going to have to see what they come up with. I think it is on a good trajectory, but I also understand the people who are saying to me, but Bright Lights was bad and Heavy Hitters was good. So do I want to commit to going to a calling that's a mixed format or a Pro Tour that's a mixed format when I have no idea what part of the Mistveil, MST, is going to be like? Right. And some people, a few people have said that to me. They said, I don't want to spend, £800 or buy a PTI or spend all that money to qualify at a ProQuest to go to Amsterdam just to find out that the draft portion of MST is really bad and not fun. And I think that's something that we have to acknowledge as well, is that the unknown quality of the limited set that's on the table is putting people off attending some events, right? So there's an argument there for making it entirely CC, right? Straight away. So that's the gameplay problem, right? Is do you think Fab is designing limited well? Do you think that heavy is as good as it can get, and is that enough for you? And how does the effects of a complicated versus simple set affect the tables, right? Affect the top tier and the meta and the CC meta, and also like which meta do you prioritize? I think the other problem that some people have in terms of tournament day aspects with draft is just the watching experience. Like the CC, for me anyway, the CC portion from the recent Pro Tour just felt so much better to watch. That's partly due to homogenization of decks in the draft, but it's also like if I watch 6 rounds of draft, I'm going to watch the same decks over and over again. Compared to like these finely tuned like CC decks, I just love the crunchiness of watching CC, and I feel like the casters know everything that's in the deck, so it kind of brings everything together in this like really good like casters playing into each other. They know what's in the deck, they know what the deck's trying to do, they know what bombs the deck has, versus this unknown draft element, which just isn't as exciting for me. And I don't know if it's exciting for other people watching as well, but I find myself sometimes, especially because it would be different if we were like poker tabling it and we saw what every single person was drafting and we could follow specific seats and stuff like that. Because we're following one person in the draft, we don't really get that picture of how the draft is developing until we see the games. But even then, we only see 3 of the games in the pod, so we don't really understand the rest of the development of the draft. So you just still kind of feel distance from it in a way that you don't from the CC pairing. It's important. The other thing, of course, that people dislike, and I think it's just worth acknowledging about Limited, is this variance piece, right? There's been a bit of a poll going around some of the more competitive players that I've seen where people are just asking, did your packs at PTLA feel weird, right? And I mean, the general conclusion I've seen so far is no, is the answer to that. But definitely the people who are asking the question, which I think is 4 or 5 people who think they were, had this experience where the whole table only had, I think they said like 16 blues for the entire like pod. And like some pods were very, very skewed towards certain class cards over others, which does happen within Fab distribution. The blue one is a new one for me. But most people are saying it's fine, but there is still the variance element that people aren't as fond of in the limited environment, right? For example. Whereas if you take your CC deck and you finely tuned it and you've tested it, skill difference is what matters versus someone opening a Majestic. Now, it is worth acknowledging that, like, you know, some majestics greatly skew the draft. Variance on number of class cards hugely impact signals. Sometimes blue. These are all like fundamental game things with variance. Mix, yeah, can ruin draft deck viability. Like, for example, if you assume there's going to be blues, because there's usually quite a lot of blues, and you're drafting reds, and then there's only 18 blues on the entire table, you're not going to have the oomph to play Guardian, for example. But someone like, you know, KO with a lot of 2-cost attacks might be able to be a lot more viable, and you don't know that until no blues show up, and you talk to the rest of your pod, and they say, "Oh, well, I didn't get any blues either. Like, where did they all go?" But I think this is the thing. The variance of a number of class cards hugely impacting signals is huge. I definitely have found that frustrating myself. You know, I open a pack that has 3 great Brute cards, so I can't draft Brute, but it still has 2 good Guardian cards. There's only 1 Warrior card, and it's average, so I have to decide, am I sending a signal that I'm playing Warrior, or am I drafting one of these cards? And that is a skill thing, but I think it's not helped by the huge variance in the packs. I feel like if there was more of a set number of X, a set number of Y, it might lead to people understanding what's going on a bit more, especially like the mid tables, like not the top tables or the bottom tables, but the mid tables where you have people who are good at draft but aren't like amazing at draft. You know, there's a lot of variance there in terms of how they can pick up on these signals, right? I think that's just worth acknowledging. Some majestics do greatly skew the draft. Like, some majestics are powerful, some majestics aren't, and whether or not you open a majestic for the hero you're already, like the class you're already drafting, also massively skews the draft. Because you could open a majestic for a class you're not drafting and take it, just to hate draft it. But if you're sitting there and you're on like this amazing KO deck, and then you open a Cast Bones, for example, in the 3rd pack, your chance of winning that draft just went massively through the roof. So, you know, yeah, we saw this with legendaries, but obviously like, this is the thing. We're not criticizing LSS here because they are constantly trying for solutions. You know, for example, legendaries, of course, used to be in the draft packs, right? In draftable packs, right? And now they've been moved to expansion slots specifically for that reason, that they greatly skewed the draft. And if someone opened like a Teklo Foundry Heart, for example, in Bright Lights, which they couldn't do, but if, like, you know, in Arcane Rising or something like that, you know, you would have had that effect. You would have had that effect where they would greatly warp the draft in their favor just because they had an extra 2 life and a powerful ability. So, you know, legendaries being taken out acknowledge the fact that there was the potential for greatly skew the draft. Majestic still being in, still skew the draft quite heavily. There are, 8 in a box or something, but, you know, it can still be a possibility that they're just the right majestic for the right person is something that can greatly sort of change FAB, because some majestics are amazing. That's just the reality. Some majestics are power cards. Like, I mean, we've got Trounce right here. If you're drafting Victor and you open a Trounce in pack 3, you're kind of laughing. So that's kind of variance. I don't put as much weight on variance as other people. I have seen fab packs with different coming out just not collated very well. That has been a problem. I don't know if it's been acknowledged in the past, but it has been a problem. And there was, of course, the problem was it 2 years ago at the Pro Tour in, I think it was one of the Pro Tours in America, maybe Baltimore, where basically the Japanese and the Belgian printings of the set had different distributions, and then what they did was basically mix the two together so that every table had a mix of German and Belgian. But players were like trying to basically touching the cards, try and figure out whether they were German whether they were Belgian or Japanese card stock, and then trying to make, like, I talked to Shamir about this, who played at that event. He was like, I'm trying to figure out whether or not this pack is a Japanese or a Belgian print, so I know what signals are being sent. And that's just a level of we can't have that. I haven't heard the same thing about heavy, and I imagine it's not the case. But you know, that is something that, you know, has impacted the game in the past. It is worth being aware of. That's currently where people are on the discussion about limited. Obviously, a lot of people do like limited. That's not what this video is for. It's not here to shit on the people who like limited. We're here to talk about the reasons why people are feeding back that maybe don't want as much limited in competitive events, and all the reasons that are being raised. And I think there's a lot of good points in here. I don't think, like, I don't think they all lead to the conclusion we shouldn't have limited and competitive fab level events, but I can understand why people are saying maybe they want less limited. I can understand the people who are just not enjoying limited in fab, and I can understand the people who are just concerned about what limited is demanding for them and how much fun they're getting in return. I think that's where we're going to leave it. Just a note, so like if you're still listening, you're clearly one of my super fans. I released recently probably one of my best videos to date, I would say, and that's generally the feedback that I've heard about it. I'm doing a series at the moment of competitive history of Fab, broken down year by year. So 2019 to 2020 is up on my channel on a separate playlist. I will be doing 2021 soon. The first 2 years were lumped together just because um, not a great deal happened in 2019 because the game only launched then. But once you get into 2021, 2022, they do have to actually take separate years because so many things happened. Those videos feature interviews with top players and members of the community who were active at the time. They feature just like a breakdown of meta decks and what meta was being played. Limited, was it constructed? What sort of constructed decks were being played? Who was winning? And where possible, I've tried to reach out to the winners of those callings and large events and get them to come and talk about what they felt about the meta. So in the most recent video, for example, you'll hear Sasha Markovic, who won the first constructed, like proper constructed calling, with which was WTR only, with a Katsu deck, and you'll hear him talk about his process. You can also hear from Dice Commando, who's obviously been in the game since the start, very large YouTube channel, very nice guy to sit and talk to. And you can hear from Hamish from Push Point, who was one of the first players to adopt Fab in the UK. It's sort of near and dear to my own heart, as well as being a friend of mine from Point. He's really transparent about why he got into Fab and what his thoughts were at the time. So come to that video if you're looking for like a vibe on how Fab was received that the year and how people felt about it, and also a breakdown of the competitive feel of Fab during that. It's a really great video. Find it on my channel. I think it's fantastic. Anyway, I'll talk to you all soon.